This lesson is check the JSON response object. The objectives for this lesson are to get a response with a body, get a response without a body, get a response with only text. You're going to see all the various differences and why it's important to stay consistent with always returning the same thing. We're then also going to take a look at how to write a generic function that can handle any kind of response. So let's start out with sending JSON with a body. Back in our web API, if we really look at each one of these endpoints that I wrote, I know I kind of went over them very briefly before, but we look at each one, like lines 27 through 32, we can see a response.status 200.json, which means we're sending a JSON object back to our client side. And the JSON object has a status text, a message, and a data property all filled in respectively. If we look at the one that retrieves a single person, we also see that we're sending back a JSON object with the status text, the message, and then the data. And you can see if we don't find a person, we're sending back a 404 with a status text and a message, but this time we're sending an error, and we looked at that before. So all of these are very consistent. But what happens when it's not consistent? Well, let's add another route here, and this one's still going to be consistent with what we have. We're going to do the / response with body, and then we're going to do a response.status 200.json, passing our same one here, but the data just has a very simple JSON object with one property called message and the value of success. Let's go ahead and save this so we have that rerun the server. Let's now go back over to the client side, and what we'll do is let's add a new button here, and it's going to call a new function that we're going to write called response with body. So let's write this down here. And what we're doing in here is we're calling the fetch, calling that new endpoint I just added, response with body. In the first then, I'm going to do a console.log on the response object. Now that is the one that we get from the fetch API. We're then going to return response.json, which will be the body, and that body is always the object that got sent from the web API. So we're going to then return that object to the second then, and we'll do a console.log on that one, and we'll do a console.log on just the data property that we saw in our JSON object on the web API server. Let's go ahead and save this. Now, back in our browser, we can see the new button has shown up here, return a body. If I click on it, we can now see all the little differences, right? So this is the response we're getting back from the fetch API. It has the body. You can see the body used now is set to true. Why? Because I did that response.json. Has some headers. The OK is true. Status is 200. Status text is OK. So once we have done the .json on that, that passes this object, which is the body that we sent down from the web API server. It passes that to the response, and you can see our same values, the status text, the message, and the data. And then the last one is I'm just retrieving response.data, which is the same as what you see right here. So it just depends on which property you want to get at. Let's now take a look at what happens if we send JSON without a body. Back in our server, let's add another endpoint here, router.get / response without body. And now you can see response.status 200.send. So just by doing a send, it just simply sends the status code by itself. So we save that. We now come back over to the client side. Let's add another button up here. And it's going to call this new function we're going to write response without body. So let's drop that one in here. And you can see the fetch call is going to call our response without body. Now look at the first then. All I can really do with this is I can get the response and then pass it straight on because there's no body. Now, it's up to you to understand what is coming back. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. We'll save it. Back in our browser, let's go ahead and see this new button. We click on it, and now you can see the response here. Everything is fine, right? if you were to try to get some body, if you were trying to do the .json, you'd get an error because there's no body there, right? So there, you can see there's nothing. I can't even expand this, so that means there's nothing there. But we are getting the response of 200, which is what happened when we did the console.log response.status. Now, the last scenario we're going to explore before we take a look at a generic function to handle all of these different situations is what happens if somebody sends text only. Not a JSON object, not just a status, but just text. Once again, go back to the web API server and let's drop in our last route here, router.get/response with text. In this case, we're now doing a response.status 200.send, and all we're sending is a piece of text. So we'll save that. We'll come back over to the client side again. Let's add another button that we can use to call a function called response with text. Let's go ahead and add that in here now. And now we can see the fetch is going to make that call. And then we have a then, the first then. I'm going to do a console.log response, but this time I'm going to do a return response.text. So what that does is it grabs whatever's in the body and returns it as text, not as a JSON object. That's what's then going to be returned back to our second then, and I'll do a console.log on that. Let's go ahead and save this. When we come back over to the browser, we can now see the new button, return text only. So once again, we take a look at the response and we can see everything looks just like it did before, but now we see the text is only the thing that's being spit out. So what we need to do now is, okay, we've seen these three different ways that we can return stuff. Well, how do we make it more generic so I don't have to sit there and figure out which one was done? Was it a body? Was it without a body? Or was it simply text? So let's write a nice little function to create a generic approach to process that response object. Back in our client side, let's add one additional button again. This one will call a function called response generic. Now, before we're going to write that one, we're going to drop in another function here. It's going to be an async function called process response object. I'm going to show you how that works in just a second here. Let's go ahead and add our function that's going to be called from that button. So the function is called response generic. And I've got the three different URIs that we just called. I got two of them commented out. We're going to do each of these one at a time. If we look now, we pass that URI to the fetch. In the first then is where we're going to say response, process response object, passing in that response. Then all I'm going to do in the second then is we'll do a console.log on that response that we get back from this generic method that I wrote. In this function called process response object, we pass in the response. I'm going to set a couple of variables here. Let text equals blank. Let data equals a empty object. Let's create a custom response object. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to make sure that we still have access to all of those properties that we need from the response object. The OK, the status text, the URL. Then I'm going to do a try catch. What I'm going to do is I'm first going to get text. So any text that I can get, I'm going to go ahead and grab that using the response.text. Now this is an asynchronous operation, so I must do the await on this. The text that's going to come back is either going to be, right, an empty string because nothing was sent, or it's going to be text, which is fine, or it's going to be a JSON object. So what I'm going to do on line 106, I'm going to attempt to parse that text as JSON. Now let's say there is a JSON object in there, then I get back data. I'm going to take that data, which I know then has a data property, right, because that's what I'm always sending back. And I'm going to grab that and put it into my return object that I created on line 95, and I'm going to put it into a new property, ret.data equals data.data. So now I've gotten the data. If from the response.text we get an empty string or simply just text, the JSON.parse will throw an exception, which means it goes to the catch piece. So in the catch, all I have to do is set ret.data equal to text, and it's either going to be an empty string or it's going to be just whatever text was sent back. Regardless, what I return is that response object with all the data, right? So I'm returning this return value here, this object that I created with all of the OK status text URL and a data property. So let's take a look at how this works. I'm going to go ahead and save this. We now see in the browser we've got the process response object. I'll go ahead and click on this, and this is then what we get back. So the first one I was calling was that response with body. So I get the status text, the URL, and the OK, and there you see the data that I get back. Let's now go ahead and go back to our front end. Let's go down and let's comment out the second one, which will give us that response without a body. Let's save that. We come back to the browser, we click on this again. We're getting the same object again, which is wonderful, right? There was no body that was sent. So if you look at the data is an empty string. Now, a lot of people ask, well, where would you ever send something without a body? Well, a good one is the delete. With a delete, you're supposed to send back a 204, no content. And that means no body. Let's once again go back to our front end. Let's comment out that line. And let's save that where we call the response with text. And let's call this one last time. We expand this and we see all the same properties. Look at the data. The data is now just that text. So this is a nice generic function that can help you process anything. Now I've shown you a generic function here that will process anything, but I'm going to encourage you to always be consistent. When you're creating your web APIs, always be returning that same JSON object and using the same properties. You change the property values as appropriate. The exception, as I mentioned, is the delete because we're supposed to return a 204, no content from a delete. Some people don't. Some people just return a 200 with the same JSON object. That's fine. Not a problem with that at all. But the consumer should always know what object to expect. They can always then unwrap it with the JSON method, and they don't have to figure out if they should use .json or .text. But again, if you're not in charge of the API and you don't know what kind of things you're going to be getting, you now have a nice little function that will help you figure that out and give you a consistent object. In this lesson, we used the .json method to retrieve the payload when it has a body. We use the response object when there's no body, and we use the .text method to retrieve text only. We also took a look at creating a generic function to handle all those situations so that you can grab whatever and return a consistent object. Coming up next, use the Fetch API to post, put, and delete data.